Okay. Take another small peek at the home front and how the war changed traditional roles, historical roles, and paved the way for future change. Talked about how African Americans joined the workforce and the armed forces in great numbers. There was some pushback about that, but the government took a role in recruiting African Americans and Hispanics to be part of the war effort. And while they may not have had social change in mind, rather wartime production, it created an atmosphere or a climate that led to social change. There was some pushback against some of the workers, against both the braceros and the African American dock workers, shipyard workers, factory workers. But at the same time, the opportunity showed African Americans and Hispanics possibilities that hadn't been there before. Now we're going to take a look at how all of this affected women. With 16 million mostly white males in the service, who's doing the work? We've already mentioned African Americans, Hispanics, and other minorities, but we also want to take a look at really the biggest number, half the population, that becomes involved, America's women. Okay, you should probably know and jot down, this occurred in 4 different ways, very school-like thing. 1, the traditional roles that women always had: wife, mother, keeper of the house, keeper of the garden in the backyard, those kinds of things. Only, as we might say today, on steroids. If mom always had a kitchen garden in the backyard, now she had a victory garden that was bigger in the backyard and canned enough food so that the family could eat all winter without having to go to the store, because there wasn't much in the stores. If mom was always kind of frugal and saved money here and there by reusing and mending, she reused and mended more. That's pretty standard stuff. Tough times call for tough people, and great need calls for great effort, and that's an example of that. More than that, in a historical sense though, is the population of jobs by women. Now, there were certain women's careers that were already established as things that women did do and could do, such as secretarial work, such as nursing. Nursing in the 1800s was a man's profession. Clara Barton changed that, and by the 1930s and 40s it was a woman's career, and it was well accepted, and thousands of women flocked to the Army Nursing Corps, the Navy Nursing Corps, but also to civilian careers in nursing in stateside hospitals. The factor of the growth of women in these jobs as opposed to the jobs themselves was what was revolutionary here. Thirdly, joining the military. This was not the 15 or 20,000 hello girl radio operators and telephone operators from World War I. It wasn't the small start of a nursing corps. This was hundreds of thousands of women, not only in those capacities, but also in auxiliaries of each of the branches of service. The WACs in the Army, the WAVES, Navy, WASPs, Air Corps, and SPARs in the Coast Guard. So all bases were covered. The women didn't have combat duty. That was a 21st century thing, the G.I. Jane kind of thing. But they did do important work that freed males, who were the only fighters at the time, to fight. So integral to the war effort. And lastly, maybe more even revolutionary than joining the military, was the so-called Rosie the Riveter phenomenon. Rosie the Riveter was a stereotype, a heroic stereotype, but represented women who worked in non-traditional, women can't do that, women don't do that, we don't want women to do that kinds of jobs. And here again, from we've always had a garden and now we're having a bigger garden, to I'm fighting the war in a factory so it can be fought on the battlefield someplace else type of range of service. So here's Ma sewing Pa's pants, nothing new there, except Pa's wearing them at the time. It's a war, you gotta move fast, and they're moving fast, they're doing more. Mom is canning more food than we've ever had so that we can have enough to eat all winter and not buy anything. The food that the industrial agriculture is producing goes to the troops. So those are traditional ways, but much more effort, kind of easy to understand. This too is something that is kind of easy to understand. If women could be typists, if that was a permissible career for women, now we need hundreds of thousands of typists. I mean, there's no such thing as inputting data and hitting send and having it go to 1 million people. If you needed 1 million people to get a certain message, you had to type it 1 million times, and that's exactly what happened. Same thing with nurses. Aside from in the military, the need for nursing and for healthcare careers skyrocketed because of the war, and women filled that need. 3 was, like I said, these auxiliaries, the WWIIs, the waves, the wasps. It's very kind of cutesy, symbolic of waves, ocean, wasps, fly, spars. I don't know what that is. It's a mast on a ship for the Coast Guard. The only thing that he come up with some acronym that indicated something was the Women's Army Corps. But it makes it sound cuter than it was. It was great service. The WASPs, for example, were great test pilots for aircraft. They couldn't be combat pilots, but they were very good test pilots. They were very good test pilots because they would do exactly what the test required. They weren't out showboating and doing barrel rolls with the new planes. They were testing them, and they were great at it, and they were favored for it. And so it was an important role, and they uniquely fulfilled it very well. Probably the most dramatic, like I said, is Rosie the Riveter. Rosie the Riveter is a woman stepping out of type, out of stereotype, out of traditional role, and into an entirely differently new role right here in the United States. While the WWIIs were known of and the waves were known of, many of them were stationed in England or in the Philippines after it was retaken, or in Australia, or in some place where overseas, or at the War Department. There was no Pentagon yet, was being built in Washington, D.C., but not in every town. But there were Rosie the Riveters working at Johnson Rubber right here in Middlefield. So this is something that was in everybody's eye. And aside from helping win the war, this is a huge social change. Everybody's seen this poster. That's the iconic one that is used for causes to this very day. It was We Can Do It. It was part of the Me Too movement that was publicized a couple years ago, still is a thing. But there's other Rosie stereotypes as well. And here's real Rosies, and you can see how valuable they were. This is a fuselage of a plane, and here's a Rosie the Riveter standing upright doing work, where a man might have to spend his day doing a half a squat in order to not hit his head on the top of the fuselage as you get back to the rear of the plane. So not only able to do work, but uniquely able to do some of the work better than anybody. Also, a social change, social and economic change. These women are not only can do the job, they can do this job better. Hey, maybe we ought to rethink that when it comes time to do it when there's not a war, would be a thought that could cross somebody's mind. I like this too, and I like you to take a look at it because it's a sign of that particular time. It's a very paternalistic, male-dominated society. Dad is in charge of the household. Mom cooks and cleans, and maybe she does have a victory garden. But now, Dad, Mr., is giving his approval to the little woman venturing out in the world. She's got her neat little Rosie the Riveter outfit to go to work, and she's ready to do industrial work. And she's proud. It isn't like she's rebellious at this. She's proud that her husband wants her to do her part. So this is the government telling conservative males that say that I want my wife home when I get home so I can have my dinner, to say, no, my wife should go out and work the second shift at Johnson Rubber because there's a war on. And while it's a wartime necessity, it's a social thing. It changes the social dynamic, begins to change the social dynamic in the war. Social change on the way. Soldiers without guns, absolutely. Not even the auxiliaries who are in the service, kind of without guns, but the secretaries, the Rosies, and the other Rosies. There was a magazine, trade newspaper called Women's Wear Daily. It may still be around, but for years and years and years it was around, and each year they would have a special issue that would be the fashion look of 1935 or the fashion look of 1960, and it was whatever it was. But in 1943, the fashion look of 1943 was Rosie the Riveter's work outfit. Wrenches, lunchbox, work shoes, jeans, work shirt, little badge to go into the factory. Women are needed to replace men in essential war industries. This woman, I found the job where I fit the best. I'm best suited to be right here, not at home, maybe not in some other job, but right there. That's where I need to be for the duration of this war. Again, I mean, I'm saying it over and over again, I'm saying it over and over again, so I think we don't quite get it. This is 2020. The beginning of the war is just about 80 years ago. So in that sense, it's ancient history. The idea that women would have to have somebody's permission to go out and get a job, or the idea that women would be somehow weird dressed up in work-type clothes, is not something that we get very much. But it was a revolutionary thing 80 years ago, or 75 years ago. And therefore, it leads to a question during the war. Once women took these kind of important out-of-the-house jobs, would they be willing to go back and cook dinner and do the laundry and have the victory garden and mend the clothes and you know, assume that role where they had before? You know, it's a leading question. We can find out when we get to later years, I guess. But we kind of know because we know what life is like now. This is not an atypical look for 2020. I mean, it's dated looking clothing and nobody has that kind of lunchbox anymore, but the idea of a woman working is not revolutionary 80 years later. So here's the question for the 1940s. Here's Rosie, and she's a pretty big lady right here. She's huge, right? She's got her work shoes on, she's got her overalls on, she's got her ball peen hammer, she's got her wrench in her pocket, she's got her lunchbox. She also has in her back pocket, I know you can't read that writing because it's all blurred, but what it says is a man-sized check, a man-sized paycheck in her back pocket. And the man, who we assume is Mr. Rosie, points to their little house. He's a little man in a little house, and you kind of think that maybe before she was Rosie the Riveter, she was maybe a little lady that fit in that house, but now she's a big lady and going to work, and the man says, hey, remember, you got to come right back home as soon as the war is over. You know, this is just an emergency. You don't get any ideas here. And she says, oh yeah, with her man-sized paycheck. Implication, the implied meaning is, once you're out and earning a man-sized paycheck, do you want to be dependent on Mr. Rosie and just fit in that little house? You've seen the sites, even if the sites is only working at Johnson Rubber. So the question is Ms. Rosie gonna wanna come back home? Is the WWII or the WWII, who has flown planes and been a test pilot and delivered bombers across the Atlantic and landed them in England, gonna wanna assume a role of asking permission to go buy $25 worth of groceries? And the answer is maybe not so much. Takeaway, it's right there. Women were instrumental to winning the war. It was vital, necessary during the war, but the social implications for later on are just as significant in a history sense. Okay.